The wind whistled through the Utah mountains, carrying the sound of snow shifting under its own weight. Deep in the woods outside Oakley, the Tiede family's cabin sat in quiet anticipation of Christmas. It was December 22, 1990, the kind of evening when the world feels still, wrapped in white silence. Inside their car, Rolf Tiede gripped the steering wheel, watching the headlights cut through swirling flakes as his wife, Kaye, hummed softly to the carols playing on the radio. Their daughters Linae, 20, and Tricia, 16, sat in the back, laughing over something trivial, their voices warm against the cold glass. Beside them, Kaye's mother, Beth Potts, smiled gently, the matriarch joining her family for what was supposed to be a peaceful Christmas in the mountains. For the Tides, this cabin was a retreat, a hand-built escape from the busy rhythm of their lives in Linae, Utah. Each December they came up here to spend time as a family, sledding, cooking, and celebrating Christmas away from the noise of the city. The cabin was cozy, filled with homemade decorations, a small wood stove, and a camcorder ready to record the memories they would make. None of them could have imagined that someone else was already waiting inside. Two men whose lives had spiraled into violence, desperation, and the kind of evil that would turn a holiday into horror. Earlier that day, Von Lester Taylor and Edward Stephen Deli trudged through the snow, their breaths coming in visible bursts of steam. Both men were in their mid-20s, and both had recently walked away from a Salt Lake City halfway house, supposedly on supervised furlough. They were not supposed to be anywhere near these mountains. Taylor, the older of the two, had a long criminal history, robbery, theft, and violent assault. Deli followed him like a shadow, quieter but no less dangerous. The two had hiked into the Wasatch Mountains, armed with a .44 Magnum revolver and a .38 Special, hopping to break into cabins, steal supplies, and disappear into the woods. But something darker was stirring in Taylor, a mix of rage, thrill, and the need for power. When they found the Tiede family's cabin empty earlier that afternoon, it felt like fate. The two men broke in easily, shattering the peaceful silence as they rummaged through drawers, opening cupboards, and helping themselves to the family's food. They lit a fire to warm the room, as though claiming it as their own. And as daylight faded, they found the family's wrapped Christmas presents stacked neatly under the tree. For a few hours, the cabin became their playground, and by the time the sound of tires crunching over the snow echoed up the drive, Taylor's mind was already made up. No one who came through that door would be leaving the same way. Rolf Tiede was the first to step out of the vehicle. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that bites the skin, and he moved quickly to unload supplies from the back. He didn't notice the faint light flickering through the cabin windows or the shadows moving behind the curtains. When he pushed open the front door, the warm air hit him first, along with the unmistakable smell of burnt wood and smoke. "Someone been here," Kaye whispered. Rolf frowned, calling out, "Hello." The answer came not in words, but in the click of a hammer being drawn back. Taylor appeared from behind the fireplace, gun in hand, his eyes wild, his voice calm in a way that made the blood run cold. "Nobody move." Deli emerged from the kitchen holding another gun. The family froze. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the faint hum of the wind pressing against the windows. Taylor motioned for everyone to get inside. "Close the door," he ordered. The Tides did as they were told. They tried to reason with the men, offering food, money, anything. But Taylor wasn't interested in negotiation. "We just need to borrow the place," he said with a grin that never touched his eyes. "You cooperate and nobody gets hurt." At first it almost seemed like he meant it. He let them sit, made small talk, even laughed at one point as Linae offered them coffee. But the calm was an illusion. Taylor's mood shifted like a flame, one moment quiet, the next explosive. When Kaye pleaded to let her family go, Taylor snapped. He raised the gun, and the deafening blast of the .44 Magnum shattered the night. The bullet struck Kaye in the chest, throwing her backward. Beth Potts screamed, lunging toward her daughter, and Taylor turned the gun on her next. The sound of the second shot rang through the cabin, echoing off the walls. In seconds, both women were dead. Smoke filled the air, the smell of gunpowder mixing with pine and blood. Rolf Tiede was shouting, begging, trying to get to his wife's side, but Taylor aimed again and pulled the trigger. The birdshot from the .38 special struck Rolf in the face, blinding him in one eye and sending him crashing to the floor. He was certain he was going to die there, next to Kaye's body, but instinct or fate forced him to move. As Taylor turned away to order Linae and Tricia to sit against the wall, Rolf crawled toward the back door, his hands leaving bloody prints across the wooden floor. He felt his way to the snowmobile shed, half blind and bleeding. Behind him, Taylor's voice echoed in the cabin, barking orders, laughing as he reloaded the gun. Rolf stumbled onto a snowmobile, the pain in his face throbbing, his vision fading in and out. He pulled the starter cord, the engine roared to life, and he tore off into the dark woods. Snow sprayed behind him as he rode blind through the night, the cold air searing his lungs. He didn't know if his daughters were alive. He didn't know if the gunmen were chasing him. He just knew he had to find help. Back at the cabin, the nightmare deepened. Linae and Tricia sat frozen, the reality of what had just happened settling in. Taylor paced the room, muttering to himself, while Deli watched from the window, nervous and jumpy. The younger man wasn't built for violence. His hands trembled as he held the gun. "We should go," he whispered. "We need to leave." But Taylor wasn't done. He began opening the Christmas presents, one by one, tearing off the paper with a manic grin. "Look at this," he laughed, pulling out sweaters, toys, small gifts meant for a family that would never open them. "Merry Christmas to us." Then, as if mocking the Tides, he found their camcorder and started recording. The footage, later recovered by investigators, showed Taylor and Deli laughing as they unwrapped the Tiede family's gifts, the dead bodies of Kaye and Beth just a few feet away. The fire in the wood stove was burning low. Taylor tossed wrapping paper and kindling onto it, watching the flames rise. "We can't leave any trace," he said flatly. "We burn it all." Outside, the forest was black and silent. Rolf Tiede was miles away now, blood freezing on his face. Speeding toward civilization through the blizzard, every minute mattered. His only thought was to save his daughters. Back in the cabin, Taylor forced Linae and Tricia to gather their coats. "You're coming with us," he ordered. "You're gonna drive." He led them outside at gunpoint, the cold hitting like a wall. The snowmobiles were still parked near the shed, their engines faintly warm from Rolf's escape. Taylor handed Linae the keys. "Start it," he said. Her hands shook so badly she could barely fit the key into the ignition. "Please," Tricia begged, "you don't have to do this." Taylor only smirked. "Oh, I do." As the engines roared to life, flames began licking out of the cabin windows behind them. Taylor had set fire to the place, pouring gasoline across the floors before they left. The orange glow lit the snow around them, casting long, jagged shadows as smoke billowed into the night sky. Linae and Tricia drove ahead, the killers following close behind on another machine, their headlights cutting through the storm. Miles away, Rolf burst into a nearby lodge, half-conscious and covered in blood. The guests inside froze at the sight of him, his face torn and swollen, his words slurred by shock. "They killed my wife," he gasped. "My family, they're still there." Someone grabbed a phone, calling 911. Deputies from the Summit County Sheriff's Office were dispatched immediately, braving the snow and darkness to reach the remote area. As the first responders made their way up the mountain roads, Linae and Tricia were still being forced deeper into the forest. Taylor was unpredictable, sometimes quiet, sometimes erupting into laughter that made the sisters' stomachs twist. Deli rode behind him, eyes darting around nervously. At one point, Taylor leaned over and shouted above the wind, "You girls ever seen hell? You're about to." The sisters exchanged terrified glances, but Linae kept driving. She had to stay calm. She had to wait for a moment, any moment when she could run. The night stretched on, cold and merciless. The snow thickened, falling in slow, suffocating sheets that blurred the forest into a wall of white. The engines of the snowmobiles growled through the darkness, their tracks carving deep scars across the frozen land. Linae gripped the handlebars, her gloves stiff with cold, her breath shallow as she tried not to cry. Behind her, Tricia clung tightly, feeling every vibration of the machine as it tore through the snow. And just a few feet behind them, Von Lester Taylor and Edward Deli followed, predators keeping their prey within reach. The two sisters didn't dare speak. Taylor had made his orders clear: keep driving, don't look back, and don't even think about running. Every few minutes his voice sliced through the night, sharp, violent, unpredictable. Turn there, keep it steady, faster. The words echoed across the mountains, carried by the wind. Linae obeyed, not because she wanted to, but because she could feel the weight of the gun pointed at her back. In the blur of snow and fear, Linae's mind raced. She knew her father had escaped. She had seen him crawl toward the back door, blood pouring from his face. If anyone could survive that, it was Rolf. The thought gave her a flicker of strength, just enough to keep going. But every mile they drove, the hope dimmed. The storm was worsening. The cold bit through their clothes, and the two men behind them were getting restless. Taylor's mood shifted again. "Stop," he barked. Linae hesitated for a second, and that was enough to set him off. He revved his snowmobile forward, closing the distance in an instant. The muzzle of his gun pressed against her shoulder. "I said stop." She pulled the brake, the machine sliding to a rough halt. The sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by the soft hiss of falling snow. Taylor climbed off his snowmobile, his boots crunching against the ice. He stood over them, breathing hard, eyes scanning the horizon. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said finally. Deli dismounted, looking pale and nervous, glancing at the girls as if silently apologizing. He seemed trapped not just in the snow, but inside his own fear of Taylor. Linae and Tricia huddled together, their bodies trembling from both cold and terror. Taylor lit a cigarette, the glow of it flickering against his face. "You know," he said, exhaling a long stream of smoke, "I didn't mean for it to go that way. Your mom, your grandma, they just didn't listen." The words were almost conversational, as if he were explaining a minor mistake instead of murder. "But you girls," he continued, "you've been good. Maybe you'll make it through this." Neither of them answered. The snow fell heavier, the darkness pressing closer. Linae stared at Taylor, trying to memorize every detail of his face, the narrow eyes, the lines carved deep into his forehead, the patchy stubble, the way his lips twitched when he lied. She wanted to remember him, not just to survive him, but to make sure that if she lived, the world would know what he'd done. Back in the valley, the rescue effort was underway. Rolf Tiede was rushed to the nearest hospital, his face covered in blood-soaked bandages. He could barely speak, but he managed to tell deputies what had happened: the two men, the guns, his wife and mother-in-law shot dead, and his daughters taken. Every word was a race against time. Sheriff's deputies called in reinforcements from multiple counties. Snowmobiles were loaded into trucks. A helicopter was prepared to lift off at first light. But the mountains were vast and treacherous. The storm had erased all tracks within minutes. The only clue they had was the glow on the horizon, a faint orange hue rising over the trees where the Tiede cabin burned. Fire crews arrived too late. The cabin was engulfed in flames, collapsing in on itself, the roof hissing under the falling snow. Inside, investigators would later find the charred remains of Kaye Tiede and Beth Potts, and a scorched camcorder that somehow, miraculously, still contained footage. But that discovery was still hours away. For now, the focus was on finding the missing daughters. In the forest, Taylor and Deli were losing their grip. The storm had turned from a problem into a threat. The temperature had dropped well below freezing and visibility was almost gone. Taylor cursed under his breath, scanning the trees. "We need shelter," he said. "There's got to be another cabin out here." Deli nodded, teeth chattering. "We should let them go," he muttered. "They'll just slow us down." Taylor spun on him. "You shut your mouth." His voice cracked through the storm like a whip. Deli flinched, stepping back. The power dynamic was clear: Taylor was in control, and he wasn't about to let anyone question him. Hours passed as they wandered deeper into the mountains. The snowmobile sputtered, engines struggling against the cold. Eventually, through the swirling white, they spotted a small cabin, abandoned, half buried in snow but standing. "There," Taylor said, pointing. Relief washed over the group as they made their way to it, breaking through the drifts. The door was frozen shut, but Taylor kicked it open with a single, angry blow. Inside, the air was stale but still warmer than outside. Dust floated in the light of a small lantern Deli found on a shelf. The place had been used by hunters, a couple of cots, a stove, old cans of food. Taylor threw down his pack, ordered the sisters inside, and started a fire. For the first time since the nightmare began, Linae and Tricia were out of the wind, but the danger hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown. They were trapped in a confined space with two armed killers, cut off from the world. Taylor sat near the fire, eyes fixed on the flames. "You girls ever think about how fast life changes?" he said suddenly. "One minute you're celebrating Christmas, the next you're out here with me. Fate's funny that way." His words carried no empathy, just twisted fascination. Deli said nothing. He sat apart, staring at the wall, his hands shaking. Linae tried to speak carefully. "If you let us go," she said softly, "you can still get away. The police won't be far." Taylor laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed through the cabin. "You think I care about the police? I've been running my whole life. What's one more day?" He stood, towering over her. "You just do what I say and maybe you'll live to see tomorrow." Tricia squeezed her sister's hand. She could feel Linae trembling. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling through cracks in the walls. Every sound felt amplified: the crack of the fire, the shuffle of boots, the faint metallic click as Taylor spun the cylinder of his revolver. The hours stretched endlessly. By dawn, Rolf's rescue message had spread across Utah. The Summit County Sheriff's Office, Utah Highway Patrol, and even federal marshals had joined the search. Helicopters scouted the mountains, their spotlights sweeping over endless white terrain. Snowmobile teams combed trails, calling out the sisters' names over the wind. But the wilderness was vast, and there was no clear trail to follow. In the makeshift hideout, Taylor's paranoia grew. "They'll be coming," he muttered, packing. "They'll have dogs, choppers, everything." Deli tried to calm him, but Taylor's mind was unraveling. He accused Deli of giving away their location, of plotting against him, of siding with the girls. Deli swore he hadn't, but the damage was done. Taylor's rage turned physical. He slammed Deli against the wall, pressing the gun under his chin. "You cross me, you die," he snarled. Then, just as suddenly, he backed away, laughing like it was all a joke. Linae watched every second of it. She realized Taylor wasn't just violent. He was unstable, unpredictable, a man who could kill at any moment for any reason. If they were going to survive, she would have to think like him, anticipate his moves, stay calm, wait for the smallest opening. That opening came sooner than she expected. Late that afternoon, the sound of a helicopter echoed faintly in the distance. Taylor froze, eyes darting to the ceiling. "They're close," he hissed. "We move now." He ordered everyone outside. The snow had stopped, leaving behind a glittering, silent world. The sunlight reflected off the drifts, blindingly bright after the long night. Taylor forced Linae and Tricia onto the snowmobiles again, pushing them to drive east toward a canyon. Deli followed, head down, his expression empty. They rode for miles, weaving through pine forests and frozen streams. Then, as they rounded a bend, they saw movement ahead, a flash of color, a figure on another snowmobile. It was a deputy from the search team. Taylor's eyes went wide. "Go," he shouted. The engines roared, the chase began. The deputy tried to cut them off, but Taylor fired a shot. The bullet whizzed past, burying itself in the snow. The officer veered away, radioing their location. Two suspects, two hostages, armed and fleeing east toward the canyon. His voice crackled through every channel. Within minutes, the mountain came alive with response. Dozens of snowmobiles converged, helicopters overhead, spotlights sweeping the trees. Linae's heart pounded. The noise, the chaos, the rising wind, everything blurred into panic. Taylor screamed orders, firing wildly behind him as officers closed in. Deli's machine hit a patch of ice and skidded, throwing him off balance. The crash sent him sprawling into the snow. Taylor barely noticed, his focus locked on escape. Linae saw her chance. She gunned the throttle, veering sharply toward a narrow trail. Taylor's snowmobile followed, but he was seconds too late. Linae and Tricia jumped off the machine, diving into a cluster of trees. Taylor's snowmobile skidded past, crashing into a snowbank. He roared in anger, firing a shot into the air. "You can't hide from me," he shouted, but his words were lost in the chaos of engines and shouts closing in from all sides. The sisters ran. Their boots sank deep into the snow, lungs burning with cold air. Behind them, the shouts of deputies grew louder. "We've got them, over here." Hands grabbed them moments later, gloved, firm, pulling them to safety. "You're safe," one of the rescuers said, his voice shaking with relief. "You're safe now." Taylor wasn't far. Surrounded by armed officers, he tried to make one last stand, firing into the air before realizing there was nowhere left to go. He dropped the gun, hands raised, his breath steaming in the cold. Deli was found minutes later, shivering and silent, sitting in the snow where he'd fallen. By the time the sun set over the mountains, both men were in custody. The Tiede family's nightmare was finally over, though the scars, both physical and emotional, would last forever. At the hospital, Rolf was reunited with his daughters. His injuries were severe, permanent damage to his eye and face, but he was alive. When he saw Linae and Tricia walk into the room, the dam finally broke. They held each other, crying, the weight of the horror they'd survived crashing over them all at once. Outside, reporters gathered as news of the Utah Christmas cabin murders spread nationwide. People struggled to understand how something so brutal could happen during what should have been the most peaceful time of year. In the coming weeks, investigators pieced together the full picture. The charred camcorder recovered from the cabin contained several minutes of footage, Taylor and Deli laughing as they unwrapped gifts meant for the Tiede family, holding up presents to the camera, their faces glowing in the firelight. In the background, the faint outlines of the victims could be seen. It was evidence so chilling, so grotesque, that even hardened detectives found it hard to watch. When confronted with the tape, Taylor showed no remorse. "They were in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said during interrogation. Deli, on the other hand, broke down almost immediately, confessing his role but claiming Taylor had done the killing. "I didn't shoot nobody," he cried. "He made me go along." But the damage was done. 2 women were dead, a family shattered, and a small mountain community forever changed. The courtroom in Colville, Utah, was silent except for the low hum of reporters setting up their cameras and the shuffle of deputies escorting Von Lester Taylor to his seat. It was early 1991, and winter still gripped the mountains, the same kind of snow that had once hidden the horror at the Tiede family cabin. Taylor sat expressionless, his eyes darting across the packed room, the prosecutors, the jury, and the surviving family members who had come to face him. Rolf Tiede was there, one side of his face marked by scars from the birdshot that nearly killed him. His daughters, Linae and Tricia, sat beside him, their hands clasped tightly together. They had survived the impossible, but now came the hardest part, reliving every second of it in front of strangers, in front of the man who destroyed their family. The prosecutors called it what it was: cold-blooded murder fueled by cruelty and control. Taylor and his accomplice, Edward Stephen Deli, had broken into the Tiede family's cabin on December 22, 1990, killed 2 innocent women, shot Rolf in the face, set the home ablaze, and kidnapped the surviving daughters. "This was not a robbery gone wrong," the prosecutor told the jury. "This was a night of deliberate terror." The evidence spoke volumes: the burned remains of the cabin, the bullet casings, and the infamous camcorder tape. When the footage was played in court, the room went still. On the screen, Taylor and Deli could be seen sitting by the fire, opening the family's gifts. Taylor held up a sweater meant for one of the daughters, laughing as he turned to the camera. "Merry Christmas," he said mockingly. The sound of crackling fire filled the room, a cruel contrast to the laughter that followed. It was a haunting portrait of 2 men, completely detached from the horror they'd caused. Taylor showed no reaction as the tape played. He stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Deli, sitting at a separate defense table, couldn't watch. He kept his head down, hands trembling. When Rolf took the stand, his voice was soft but steady. He told the jury about the moment they arrived at the cabin, the sound of the gun, the way his wife fell, the heat of the fire as he crawled through blood and smoke to escape. He described driving the snowmobile through the storm, half blind, praying his daughters would survive. "I didn't think I'd make it," he said quietly. "But someone pushed me forward. I had to get help. I had to save them." Linae followed, her testimony raw and vivid. She told the jury how Taylor laughed as he opened the presents, how he made them drive into the night, how the flames consumed their home behind them. At one point, her voice broke. "He looked at me and said we were lucky to be alive," she said through tears. "But I don't think he meant it." The jurors listened in silence, many with tears in their eyes. The brutality of the crime left little room for doubt. Taylor's defense tried to argue that the murders were impulsive, that he had panicked, that he hadn't intended to kill anyone when he entered the cabin. But the prosecution countered with evidence showing Taylor's pattern of violence, his escape from the halfway house, and his deliberate decision to bring 2 loaded guns into the mountains. "This wasn't panic," the prosecutor said. "This was pleasure. He enjoyed what he did." As for Deli, his defense painted him as a follower, a weak man caught in Taylor's shadow. His lawyer argued that Deli had been terrified of Taylor, that he'd only obeyed to stay alive. And while the evidence showed that Taylor had fired the fatal shots, Deli's participation in the burglary, arson, and kidnapping was undeniable. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned with their verdict. Taylor was found guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of capital murder. When the judge read the sentence, the courtroom was silent. "Von Lester Taylor," he said, "for the murders of Kaye Tiede and Beth Potts, you are sentenced to death." Taylor's expression didn't change. He looked at the judge, then at the audience, and smiled faintly. "You can kill me," he said, "but it won't change what happened." Deli's trial came soon after. Though prosecutors sought the death penalty for him as well, the jury spared his life. He was convicted of second-degree murder, arson, and kidnapping, and sentenced to life in prison. When asked if he had anything to say, Deli muttered a single sentence: "I wish I'd never met him." For the Tiede family, the verdicts brought a measure of justice, but not peace. Kaye and Beth were gone, and no sentence could undo that. In the months following the trials, Rolf sold what was left of the Oakley property. He couldn't bring himself to rebuild. Every time he thought of the cabin, he saw the fire, the snow, the faces of his wife and mother-in-law frozen in time. Linae and Tricia struggled to return to normal life. They were young, just 20 and 16, yet they carried the kind of trauma most people couldn't imagine. For years, they avoided the media, focusing instead on healing quietly, away from the cameras. In rare interviews, Linae would later say that surviving wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a long fight to reclaim their lives. "I had nightmares for years," she said. "Every sound in the dark felt like it was him coming back. But I had to live, for my mom, for my grandma." Investigators later described the case as one of the most haunting they'd ever seen. The camcorder footage became a symbol of evil, proof of how far detached Taylor had become from humanity. Even seasoned detectives admitted they'd never encountered anything like it. "It wasn't just murder," one said. "It was mockery. He took their joy, their Christmas, and made it his own spectacle." Over the years, Taylor's name appeared in headlines again and again as he appealed his death sentence. His lawyers argued that his confession had been coerced, that his mental state hadn't been properly considered, that Deli had played a larger role than believed. But every appeal failed. The courts reaffirmed the original ruling each time, citing the overwhelming evidence of Taylor's guilt and the brutal nature of his crimes. From his cell on Utah's death row, Taylor gave occasional interviews. His words remained chillingly consistent. "It was just something that happened," he once told a reporter. "I don't think about it much." When asked if he felt remorse, he shrugged. "What good would that do now?" Deli, serving life without parole, rarely spoke publicly. In prison, he became withdrawn, avoiding other inmates and refusing interviews. According to guards, he spent most of his days reading or staring out the window, never talking about the murders. As the years passed, the story of the Tiede family tragedy became part of Utah's dark history, retold in documentaries, podcasts, and crime shows. Each retelling brought the same question: how could something so monstrous happen to such a kind, ordinary family? The Tides had done everything right. They worked hard, they loved each other, they cherished the holidays. They had simply gone to their cabin to celebrate Christmas. And because two violent men chose that night to break in, their world was destroyed. For investigators who worked the case, certain images never faded: the burned remains of the cabin, the charred Christmas gifts scattered across the floor, the melted remains of the camcorder that somehow still preserved its grotesque footage. It was like time stopped inside that cabin, one detective said, a perfect snapshot of horror. The story resurfaced again in 2019 when Utah's Supreme Court reviewed Taylor's latest appeal. He claimed ineffective legal counsel and sought to overturn his death sentence. The court denied it. Nearly 3 decades after the murders, Taylor remained on death row, still awaiting execution. Deli, meanwhile, remained in the Utah state prison system, older, quieter, his life defined by the crime he could never escape. For the Tiede family, time moved differently. Rolf lived many more years, watching his daughters grow, build families of their own, and find peace in small ways. He became a quiet advocate for victims of violent crime, speaking occasionally about survival and resilience. "I used to ask why," he once said in an interview. "Why us? Why then? But there's no answer. You just have to live with the pieces that are left." The daughters, Linae and Tricia, rarely spoke publicly after the early 2000s. They rebuilt their lives quietly, choosing privacy over publicity.